Hello, I'm Brainerd Carey, Director of Praxis Center for Aesthetics, and today I want to talk a little bit about your artist statement. This is one of the strangest pieces of writing ever, and it's one of the more difficult things to work on. In Praxis Center, I talk about this all the time, and there's an editor there that's always editing people's artist statements because it's one of the more difficult things to do. And I'm going to explain why. Praxis Center is a place where, of course, there are members and I teach, and there are students there like yourself, and we all learn about a variety of things. But the artist statement is something that's worked on there more than almost everything else. There's tons of questions asked, but the artist statement is an incredibly common thing that people are struggling over, and that I help students edit with the help of a professional editor as well. So to begin with, an artist statement. What is it used for? Why does it exist? What is it? It's used for a variety of things. Sometimes applications for grants to get into a gallery, an open call for a group show, often requires, among other things, an artist statement. They ask for whatever they ask for, but one of the elements is often an artist statement. So what is an artist statement? Is it kind of a statement on who you are, your work, your mission? Well, let's talk about how artist statements began, because they're a very recent invention. They weren't around in the 40s, 50s, or 60s. This is a post-70s idea that started taking root in artist applications everywhere, really, in the 80s, in common form. And the reason is that with the rise of a lot of conceptual art in the 70s, when artists would provide slides for a show or an application for a show or a grant or a residency, sometimes the images that they were giving didn't fully reflect their work. In other words, the images, if the art was conceptual or performative or a whole variety of things, an image alone, unlike in the past when people were submitting paintings or drawings or prints or photography, with conceptual art and some sculpture even, you needed to say more about the work. You needed to tell the jury that was looking at your images exactly what this was all about, right? So they allowed you to make an artist statement. Again, it was really for artists who were working in a form that was almost impossible to photograph. And most artists aren't doing that today. Many are, with some conceptual art and other forms of perhaps sculpture. But generally, you can see what an artist is doing by their image. So with the rise of some people say the ascendancy of words with artwork and conceptual art, a statement was necessary. At that point, what happened was in the 80s and into the 90s, it just became the norm to ask for an artist statement all the time on grants, on applications, on open calls. And it became and still is one of the most confusing pieces of writing. So essentially, what an artist statement is now is not a manifesto. It's not a piece of philosophy. It's not something that needs to be full of jargon like you have an MFA or a PhD in fine art. It should be fairly straightforward and should allow the reader to know you a little bit more. So first, I'll say things that should not be in an artist statement. It should not be a biography. It should not be in third person. It should be in first person because it's your statement and it's about yourself. It's something you're saying. It should also not be about why you make art. That's beside the point and doesn't really give people insight into what's happening in most cases. What an artist statement should be is a way of helping people to unlock a little bit when they look at the images or the work that you're making, to unlock a little bit about who you are so they understand your imagery better. One way to do that is to tell them about your process. A really simple, direct way to do it is just to talk about process. How is it that you build your images, whether it's, you're a filmmaker, visual artist, performer, conceptual artist, sculptor, painter, whatever it is. How do you build your images? What is your process in the studio? Just talking about process is one way to do it, as opposed to what the images mean or what you mean. That's also a little bit of a deadly category to get into. Um, because everything often, you may intend something with your images, they may read away to someone else. If your work is political in orientation, if your work is message oriented, then yes, you could talk, instead of about process, about message. What is the message behind your work? What is it that you're trying to work with? If you're talking about where you come from, if you're talking about any issues related to minorities, gender preference, or politics in terms of how you're perceiving the world, or activist ideas, by all means, that should be the artist statement. Keep in mind, the artist statement should be brief, 250 words or less, not very long. So again, it's in first person, it's 250 words or less. And essentially what it should say is that something about what the options I'm giving here today. There are other options. It should say either something directly about your process, because process is a very easy thing to essentially talk about, whether you're a printmaker or painter or sculptor or filmmaker, or no matter what you're doing, just talk about process. Do not talk about why you make art. Everybody more or less makes art for the same reason, to be expressive, or to become one with the world. Those are too common. We see that too often. That's not what a jury wants to hear. They want to hear either about your process, or if you have a specific way of looking at the world and that's the message you're trying to get across, then talk about that. Talk about the message that you're trying to get across to the world. That would be ideal, but it doesn't have to be, because perhaps you're a painter or another type of artist that your work isn't message oriented. Your work's abstract, and your intention isn't to have a specific message. That's okay too. Then don't talk about message. Talk about process, how you make what you make. One other way to do this, if you want to be a little more intellectual about it, which generally I think is good to avoid, there's a lot of writing these days about how there's too many artist statements full of jargon, and this is very common, to have an artist statement that's hard to read. It's full of jargon. It's something that people learn when they get their MFAs. That's not what impresses juries. They want to read something very clear. But if you want to be a little more intellectual in your artist statement, one thing you can do is to make an analogy. If you've seen a recent movie or a book that you've read, could be anything from a current novel, piece of kind of exploratory writing, history, to something you read when you were a child, a book, or a movie. These are all cultural references that I'm talking about, movies or books. You can compare your art to one of these movies or books. And I don't mean directly. You could make an analogy, something that talks about how your work relates to the world, or is intended to relate to the world, the way this book talks also about relating to the world. That's a little more of an intellectual way of doing it. And I'm not saying that has to be done, but that's a third option to do something that's a little more intellectual. Just make an analogy to something cultural. Curators love that. Juries love that, because it gives them something to hold on to and makes them feel that this is really clear. So let me see. There's a few questions. Yeah, this is a nice one. What Michael's saying is, state your dominion over your position as president and executioner of your own account, theme, and judge as your own trustee. I mean, that's interesting. As I read that, as I interpret what he's saying, you can, state your opinion as the person who is building, owning, doing all of this, in terms of what it is that your position is. Why are you in this position? Why are you? What's your state your dominion over that? That's an interesting way to put it. Let's see. Um, so if and a number of other things you said there too. That's interesting, Michael. Good points. So I hope this talk was helpful for those who will hear it today live, or whenever you are going to hear it. Don't hesitate to make comments. And if anybody's interested in having their statement edited and having lots more feedback, don't hesitate to use the link below to join Praxis Center. You can join it monthly and you can cancel at any time. So if you're interested in having more feedback, having your website reviewed, having your artist statement and bio edited, don't hesitate to consider joining by using that link. And I'll personally be reviewing a lot of things, and there's a professional editor there that will edit your statement, your bio, and sometimes other pieces of writing. So I wish you all well. Thanks for being here today, and have a wonderful day, and have a great time in your studio.